All right. Well, again, good morning and welcome to another Florida Association of Counties webinar. This morning, we are joined by JonesEdmunds. We have Justin Gregory and Mark Nelson from JonesEdmunds joining us to discuss resiliency. The state of Florida has been active and the legislature has moved a lot of different bills and set up a lot of programs for local governments to prepare for the effects of sea level rise and weather changes. So today we have our webinar, Weathering the Storm, Planning for Resiliency. You're going to hear more about vulnerability assessments. They're going to talk specifically about one county's vulnerability assessments, but those new state requirements that are now in effect. So without further ado, I will kick it over to Justin and Mark to get us started.
All right, thanks, Jeff. We really appreciate this opportunity to present on a topic that we are very passionate about and very actively involved with numerous resiliency-related efforts for counties and municipalities throughout Florida. Again, my name is Mark Nelson. I'm a senior consultant supporting our resiliency and asset management-related efforts and clients throughout Florida. Justin, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. And I'm Justin Gregory. I'm a senior manager at JonesEdmunds and working on a number of vulnerability analyses or vulnerability assessments across the state at the moment.
Yeah, so I'll walk us through kind of a broader discussion of the Resilient Florida vulnerability assessments, the adaptation plans and implementation projects, and then Justin will kind of dive in deeper to some of the work that we're doing for an inland county, Alachua County. So the state's been obviously racing to keep up with guidance to match the fire hose of funding that they've been providing, including the Florida Adaptation Planning Guidebook, which I think came out in like 2018, and then the more recent Standardized Vulnerability Assessment Scope of Work Guidance. I'll walk us through at a high level, the three primary steps from the vulnerability assessment, the adaptation plan, and some of those implementation strategies. So the Resilient Florida program was established with Senate Bill 1954, which directed the state and the DEP to create the statewide vulnerability assessment and sea level rise resiliency plan. And backing that has been about over $700 million in funding over the last 2 years, dedicated entirely to local governments to support this program and its projects. The vulnerability assessment grants, the first step in this process, and this last year there were about 128 project awards. And these are 100% grants, no match required, for a total of about $28 million. And these projects range from roughly around $50,000 on the low end to $500,000 on the high end. We are assisting numerous counties, and we have assisted numerous counties and cities apply for these. Many applicants that were doing this didn't really know what to apply for because they didn't really understand the full scope of work because there wasn't a lot of history here. And so in some cases, some of those folks are actually going back to the well and applying for more funding in either this last round or in this next round of vulnerability assessment grants that opens up in July. I'd expect everyone on this call to have staff engage or be engaged in a vulnerability assessment plan for their county, or preparing to solicit help either directly via RFP or for your vulnerability assessment. So just a quick look at the legislative intent as this helps set up the discussion for the vulnerability assessment. The state is particularly vulnerable to adverse impacts from flooding resulting from increase in frequency and duration of rainfall events, storm surge from more frequent and severe weather systems, and sea level rise. Such adverse impacts pose economic, social, environmental, and public health and safety challenges to the state. It's pretty straightforward and common sense. It's these future economic and environmental challenges or impacts that we are assessing and helping propose solutions for. The vulnerability assessment standards are generally codified in this Florida statute. There's still significant room for interpretation in the broad requirements laid out here. And then, they still need previously mentioned guidance documents, but even with those guidance documents that we previously talked about, there is still a lot of leeway for interpretation and approaches to these vulnerability assessments. So I think it's important to kind of get participate in some of the DEP help that's out there, as well as get folks who are experienced in performing these vulnerability assessments. So from a broad level, what are the goals of a vulnerability assessment? Of course, educating your stakeholders, the community, that is, doing that infrastructure planning out in the future, getting funding for those projects, and then hopefully at some point, kind of taking a look back at your internal and county level and state level regulatory framework and how that supports some of this work in the vulnerability assessment. Another way to look at this from a county level for a vulnerability assessment, you want to make sure you complete a vulnerability assessment that satisfies the DEP's statutes and guidelines. You want to identify vulnerable critical infrastructure, and then you want to develop grant fundable adaptation projects to protect your most critical infrastructure. So some of the steps for a typical vulnerability assessment, up front, we usually establish, we being, participating with a county or city, you establish that steering committee, which may be made up of your public works director, your utility director, your facilities director, or folks like at that level, as well as, in some cases you'll have somebody at the political level participating, and folks from your disaster response or recovery group. Slide just finished. So once you get through and you establish a steering committee, they're kind of sitting on your shoulder, helping provide guidance through that process. You got to acquire all that critical background information, especially the critical facilities that you're concerned with. Whether that be your lift stations, your pump stations, your evacuation routes, your hospitals, all that sort of information is the critical facilities that we're concerned with when we start the heavy lift, which is the exposure analysis. And the exposure analysis is essentially that modeling effort. And we do that through the stormwater modeling, and a large portion of that, especially for the inland inundation side, is important. So then we do the coastal inundation modeling and put those two things together to produce the compound flooding. And then, with that, once we understand the compound flooding, we overlay that flooding with all that critical infrastructure into the sensitivity analysis. And the sensitivity analysis, we kind of try to understand the sensitivity of that critical infrastructure to the depth and duration of flooding, and whether or not that is in fact a concern for that infrastructure. Through this process, we probably have done public outreach maybe on the get-go and early part of the project, and later on, once we've gone through the sensitivity analysis to communicate the impacts of that compound flooding on that infrastructure. And then we present that information in the final vulnerability assessment. Call it an optional task, but one of the kind of focuses we typically try to do in these vulnerability assessments is at least have some level of adaptation plan, maybe we call it a preliminary adaptation plan, so that you can get those early out projects and get applications in for funding for those projects while that funding is still available. So those adaptation plans, or the preliminary adaptation plans, we feel are very important. So this is kind of just to kind of tie some of this together on the sea level rise side, an example for some work that we're doing in Northeast Florida and St. Johns County in the city of St. Augustine. These are some of the NOAA sea level rise projections. And this graph here shows an intermediate low and intermediate high graphs, and sort of the type of sea level rise you're going to see in those scenarios, from 0.5 foot to 1.5 foot in the 2040 scenario to 1 to 3 feet in the 2070 scenario. And then the graph on the left is kind of tying that into a vertical datum and mean high water, which is typically what we use in the modeling world. We'll use that mean high water as a boundary condition in our modeling. So for example, a lot of the work that has been done historically over the last 10, 15 years has been using roughly elevation 2.0 or 1.96 for that boundary condition for a lot of the coastal inundation modeling, and from the also the stormwater inland inundation flooding modeling. And so, but projecting forward now into current times, already we're seeing since the 1996 mean high water, we're seeing about 2.5 or half a foot of sea level rise reflected in the average mean high water that we're using for that modeling. And then looking forward, you can kind of see how that plays out for that for sea level rise for various scenarios. For like example, the mean high water of 2.5 plus a 2040 intermediate high produces a 3.2 or roughly 3/4 of a foot of higher boundary condition elevation that we're using for a lot of the modeling moving forward. And when we look at the, say, 2040. On the rainfall side, started with that very intro graph that we had on the cover slide, which was a NOAA radar from that South Florida storm that caused some extreme rainfall down in especially Fort Lauderdale. But the rainfall intensity is obviously something that we're looking at and projecting in a lot of modeling that we're doing moving forward. And Justin will kind of expand on that in his presentation. But we're seeing changes in the rainfall depth and in the extreme rainfall frequency. And as a rough example, I think it's about 30 to 40% higher total depth for a typical, say, 100-year, 24-hour rainfall event is the type of additional rainfall that we're using in the models that we're for the projecting out into the future. So this is an example of kind of just using building structures as a surrogate for understanding the type of potential impacts that we're seeing for these compound flooding scenarios. And so in this example community that we may have performed this work for, there's roughly 4,800 structures within the city limits that we're looking at here, and that all those black dots represent structures. So in the current scenario, the FEMA 100-year floodplain as it's defined currently, there are about 217 structures within the city that are at some level within those polygons or within the 100-year floodplain. They may in fact be elevated and out of the 100-year floodplain, but they're within the spatial extent of the 100-year floodplain. Moving forward into 2040, when we take the modeling exercise and use those boundary conditions and sea level rise, this is the sort of scenario we get. We go from 217 structures to 1,115 of the 4,080 structures potentially being impacted. Again, they could be elevated structures, they may not in fact be flooding in the structure itself within the finished floor. But then, it's just important as a, example scenario. And then looking forward to 2070, another example of the 100-year floodplain, and over half of the structures within the municipality could potentially see inundation. So sort of a scary example, but, a worthy example nevertheless. And in terms of communicating those results, I think that's one of the challenges, of course, both ourselves, executing these vulnerability assessments, and then through our steering committees and the politicians that support this work, how that information is provided to the communities. And so this just being an example of sort of one of those challenges. So, finished floor elevation of this structure at roughly 4.7. A 100-year floodplain, as it had traditionally been established, maybe from studies from the past 10 or 20 years, was calling that at 5, elevation 5. So already seeing, that this structure likely would require flood insurance, but we've, for example, then maybe mapped the 100-year floodplain, and we know currently the 100-year floodplain actually is already at 5.5. and then projecting that forward into, say, 15 years or so from now, you see an elevation of something like 7. And so again, just an example of trying to communicate those results, and moving forward, then what does that do in terms of the challenges that we have for these vulnerability assessments? Because once these results are out there, the folks that will represent this work and the communities that will represent this work will have a challenge in terms of, just from example, managing growth moving forward. All of us, we're going to see, of course, more homes, more subdivisions, new commercial growth, and trying to use that data to then potentially have it, whether that's influencing decisions that are being made relative to that growth. Another challenge, of course, that we both have is communicating the uncertainties of that data. So there's a wide variety, or not wide variety, but uncertainty in the future sea level rise scenarios, the rainfall intensities, and other factors that are going to affect the extent of flooding. And then, of course, most importantly is the funding and the challenges that are there in terms of of course, there's a pretty good pot of money out there that's a 50% match for the actual infrastructure improvement projects, but that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the challenges that we're going to have as it relates to funding the improvements necessary. I think this is an important slide, and we can certainly be open to entertaining some discussion on this, but I think one of the most challenging things that we face as professionals today is this regulatory framework, and it doesn't adequately support the conservative planning, design, and construction of infrastructure like roads, homes, and often entire subdivisions. We're planning, designing, and constructing infrastructure for the next 50 years right now, but we're basing that on rainfall data and outdated FEMA maps, typically from 10, 15, sometimes 20 years ago. And that gap is leading us to build critical infrastructure, roads, homes, entire subdivisions, in some cases too low or without enough capacity to deal with what lies ahead. So jumping forward into, again, once we get through the vulnerability assessment, we develop an adaptation plan or a preliminary adaptation plan. And what comes out of that are the types of implementation projects that we want to see funded. And again, like I said, that's where we saw, I think, $275 million worth of funding in this current cycle. And I think there was $400 million in the previous cycle, 50% matches for that. And that critical part of this is that these vulnerability assessments moving forward need to identify that and demonstrate that those projects are in their adaptation plan. And then that helps really support the application process for these implementation projects. And so from the DEP's Resilient Florida broader perspective, these are the sorts of things that they're supporting for these implementation projects, the transportation assets and evacuation routes. Obviously those, you can demonstrate where you've got flooding and potential need to harden, raise those evacuation routes or do things to that effect. Natural, cultural, and historic resources. But what we really see a lot of is our wastewater, stormwater, and other, typical utility infrastructure, and then critical community facilities like fire stations, hospitals, etc. What we're really seeing, though, in the actual, projects that are coming out from a lot of the vulnerability assessment projects that we've been involved with are a lot of typical, raising roads, stormwater, operable valves, pumps, seawalls, and in limited cases, some retreat scenarios with property acquisition and things like that. So, kind of wrapping up here in terms of my bigger picture overview, this is an example of the 2022-2023 implementation projects that are out there that have been funded, that $275 or so million worth of projects. The current vulnerability assessment the current Resilient Florida application cycle is about to open up here in July. And so, get out there and use your VA to support your implementation projects. With that, I'll turn it over to Justin to dive a little deeper into a little different example or more detailed example of what we're doing with Alachua County.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm going to talk a little more about an inland county we're working with on a climate vulnerability assessment. And this was included in part of a much broader project for the county to complete a climate vulnerability analysis. So Alachua County has identified climate change as one of the big threats to the county. And they have worked on a very broad set of climate actions to help them ultimately develop what's going to be called a climate action plan. And as part of that, one component of that is developing a vulnerability analysis. And that's looking at vulnerability to all aspects of climate change, which includes flood risk. This project was, when we started on the project, the county had not received funding, but during the course of the project, they received funding for to complete a vulnerability analysis. And we were able to expand the project to include that. So the county has spent a lot of effort on public engagement and stakeholder engagement throughout this process. At the start of the project, we conducted a broad weather-related survey for the county, public survey, trying to understand what the public's understanding of risks due to climate change, extreme weather, and to find out where the county have a better understanding of the public's impressions of that. We also, actually just on Friday, the county hosted their annual county climate fair, which is an opportunity for both the public, stakeholders to get together and discuss climate threats, and we presented there on our work as well. Throughout the project, the county established a Citizens Climate Advisory Board, which has a lot of knowledgeable citizens regarding the science of climate change. And so one of the key factors that we at the start of the project was that we consider the latest science. So a lot of the climate change work that is out there is based on model runs that are well over 10 years old now. And so our work has all been performed using the latest CMIP6 data. And we spent a lot of time evaluating the various shared socioeconomic pathways, so looking at how the world is going to respond to climate change and making sure we were using an appropriate approach for evaluating impacts and effects on the county. Extreme temperatures. So we wanted to show the citizens just what these changes could look like. And you can see when we start looking at changes in average annual daily minimum and maximum temperatures, you're looking at about a 6-degree Fahrenheit increase in those average temperatures over the next up until 2100. But we know that one of the impacts to all of us living in Florida know that it's really humidity and temperature is what impacts us. So we also broke that down and started looking at the heat index, the projected heat index moving forward. And I say one of the key kind of items to take away from that is the number of extremely hot days. So what we're showing in this figure is the number of days that would be classified as extremely hot. This is when it becomes dangerous to work outdoors. And we can starting to see the potential for a large economic impact to the county and to health of outdoor workers just based on the number of days. So that's almost think about more than a 3.5-fold increase in the number of extremely hot days that are projected moving forward by 2100. So substantial impacts to the county from that. And we were able to take a lot of the data we have for the county, the spatial data, and start identifying heat vulnerability and how that varies across the county. So the goal of this is to identify which communities in the county are most at risk of extreme heat. And we were able to work with Fernleaf on this, looking at exposure and adaptive capacity to map vulnerability across the county. And then we can overlay that with various data sets that we have mapped. And in this case, we're looking at mobile homes and how mobile homes are often suffer more from heat exposure just due to lack of air conditioning, poor insulation, high energy use. So we can go ahead and identify where in the county we have a combination of heat vulnerability and mobile homes. We looked at a number of other factors such as age of population, and presented the county with a pretty broad evaluation of heat vulnerability countywide. Agricultural production is a key part of the county's economy, and they wanted to get an idea of how climate change could impact that. So looking at drought indices, the Agricultural Reference Index for Drought, ARID, is a commonly used agricultural drought index. And for what that means, an index of 1 would mean you have an extreme drought. And in this case, we're looking at a 30-day drought index. So 1 means an extreme drought with no water in the soil profile, no available water in the soil profile. And what we can see is a lot of variability in drought is predicted, but we can see a constant increase in that severity of that drought. So we're looking at an increase in drought affecting agriculture within the county. And we can break that down even further and start looking at the month-by-month drought index. And what we can start seeing is April, May, June. So we know April and May are usually our driest months, but we can see increasing drought, level of drought, intensity of that drought moving forward, as well as that kind of drought expanding into June and July, which have historically been wetter months. So the changing rainfall patterns are impacting, and the changing temperatures are impacting that drought and how that's going to be distributed across the county over time. Given the importance of drought and agricultural production, we worked on developing crop models for some representative crops within the county. We looked at row crops, agriculture, vegetable crops, and we were able to look at, in this case, corn or maize, at how that production is going to change. So these models they're actually modeling the growth of the crop, looking at the climate inputs, the soil types. And what we can see is the corn yields are predicted to significantly decrease. So the current cultivars of corn that are grown in Alachua County really struggle with the heat and the water deficit stresses that are predicted based on the climate data. And we can see this, what that is requiring a significant increase in irrigation and fertilizer need to even for the crop to survive or to attempt to maintain production. But even under when we evaluated well-irrigated, well-fertilized scenarios, we still see significant drops in yield for corn in Alachua County. We looked at snap beans as an example of a vegetable crop. So a wide variety of vegetable crops are growing. This was just one example we looked at. And what's interesting is we see snap beans actually benefit initially from the increased carbon dioxide. So that provides the snap beans are able to take advantage of that, which provides additional CO2 fertilization for the crops. But eventually the impacts of the heat and the water deficit start to decrease yields. The figure on the bottom right is showing the percentage change in above ground biomass. So the plant actually does pretty well, but the yields are significantly lower. So the plant grows well, but is not able to provide a yield. So a challenge with that. And then we also looked at bahia grass. So bahia grass, a crop that's commonly grown across the county, used for forage and grazing. And what we can see is bahia grass actually does pretty well under the projected climate change scenario. So it benefits from the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, can take advantage of that, and it can take advantage of the increased temperature. So a crop which does pretty well. So we thought these 3 crops were good examples of kind of just the variety and how variable the response of the current agricultural production in the county will likely be to the changing climate. Now, we know there's also a lot of livestock produced within the county, a lot of animal production, and we know that livestock, as with people, livestock are really sensitive to a combination of temperature and humidity. And a lot of research has gone into what's called the temperature humidity index, and then correlating that with stress in livestock. So stress in cattle, goats, chickens. And we can see that trend is constantly increasing between now and 2100. So we know that T8, the temperature humidity index, is going up. And we can take a look at one particular industry, which is the dairy farming industry, and start seeing that this is the number of days that the temperature humidity index would exceed thresholds. So for dairy cow production, we know that milk production starts reducing at about a temperature humidity index of about 68, and that dry cows start suffering chronic stress at about a temperature humidity index of 77. So we can start counting the number of days where dairy cows are going to have to be actively cooled. So this, you can see, it's going to create a significant additional cost for dairy production in the county and have the impacts. The county wanted to understand the effects of climate migration on population projections. So the expectation is that with sea level rise, there is going to be some climate migration with people moving away from the coast. And we worked to try and identify how that could impact an inland county like Alachua County. And there is some research looking at how the Florida population is likely to respond to sea level rise. And we were able to take that data and combine it with the statewide population projections to see how those populations are likely to be impacted. We can see an additional 30,000 people potentially due to sea level rise by 2100 in the county's population. We were then able to take that data and map it spatially, so we can look at a growth model for the county, which looks at parcel by parcel how population is likely to grow and expand across the county. And we're able to look, so this is showing the current population density in the county, and I'll switch it, you'll see that change to the 2100 population density. Let me go back quickly, and you can kind of see how you're seeing that change in density. So what you mainly see is where we're getting new populations, and we can see that starts impacting agriculture. And this is assuming current kind of zoning regulations and planning requirements. We're potentially seeing a lot of impacts to agriculture based on that expanding population and the spread of population around the county. Wildfire is a concern within the county. The county manages a lot of land, and there's a lot of forestry within the county, and we wanted to evaluate wildfire risk. And one of the factors in wildfire is the climate, and we're able to look at the Keach-Bryan drought index. And this is looking at the 30-day maximum, so kind of how bad the fire risk is from a climate perspective over a 30-day period each year. And what we can see is in the county, every year we have high fire risk days. So we have at least a month of high fire risk within the county, or at least 30 days of high fire risk. But what we can see moving forward, we're going to repeatedly and almost consistently meet levels of extreme fire risk. So where the climate is at an extreme level of extreme fire risk, which starts to impact the likelihood that a fire will form. Also makes it a lot more difficult for control burns because we generally you can't complete control burns under extreme fire risk conditions or high fire risk conditions. So a significant impact on the county in managing their lands and in private forestry from managing fire risk. The other factor that influences fire risk is what's called the wildland urban interface. So this is where wildlands and urban areas meet. And what we're able to do is combine the population projection data we have with the definition of this wildland urban interface. So this is an area where infrastructure is most vulnerable to to wildfire. It's where we're most likely to have wildfires forming. It also becomes very difficult to do control burning in this interface, just because of the infrastructure that's in place. So we'll look here as the change in that wildland urban interface between current conditions and 2100. And what we're expecting is almost a doubling of that across the county. So it follows actually very similar what we've seen in the past with that changing wildland urban interface and how that impacts the county. So moving to a little more of some of the water impacts, rainfall is projected, continues to be variable as we see in the past. So rainfall is variable, perhaps a slight increase in an annual rainfall up until 2100. But what's most visible in the rainfall totals is kind of those extreme rainfall events. So we know with increased temperature, we are getting more, we're increasing rainfall depths. We have more energy in the storms. So there was a lot of research gone into that over the last few years, and pretty conclusively, I think, showing that rainfall depths are going to increase with extreme storms, but they're happening in fewer extreme storms. So rainfall totals stay about the same, but we have fewer larger storms. We were also able to look at reference evapotranspiration, and that is showing is an increasing trend, primarily driven due to temperature, and that aligns with measured data in the past. So we're able to take that data and look at how that changes recharge and groundwater models within the county, and starting looking at impacts to that. And we're just going to show you quickly. And what we're seeing there is the range is fairly similar to what we've seen in the past, but especially for average years, there's not much change across the county in average groundwater levels. But what we are seeing is some lower conditions during some of the drier periods. And then also in wet years, we're seeing consistently higher. So we're actually getting, because of those fewer larger storms, we're actually getting significantly more recharge to the aquifer in higher wet periods, which has an impact on flooding as well. And this is, we looked at wells across the county, and we're able to see which wells are likely to be vulnerable to those lower conditions as well. So see which populations might be need to not have sufficient domestic water supply. Surface water lakes, so we looked at lakes across the county. Lakes are a valuable resource in Alachua County. And we use long-term models of lake levels and lake areas related to rainfall and evapotranspiration. And we're able to take those models and project how lakes are likely to respond. And we see a lot of variety and a lot of variation in how the lakes respond across the county. In this case, Orange Lake projected to increase initially, but then some significant decreases moving forward, while Lake Santa Fe actually shows about the same, if not a slight increase in average water levels. And we also looked at flow, so a model of flows in the Santa Fe River, and we see something similar there, where flows are very variable, continue to be variable, but once again, the increased rainfall is actually helping to sustain those flows, and no significant change in river flows on the Santa Fe River. Now, water supply was another concern. So we are using, in this case, we're looking at projected irrigation demand and how that changed over the county, and looking at how water supply is influenced by ET, population changes, land use, agricultural practice. So really summing up a lot of what we've looked at previously. And then developing a range of potential water demands based on various assumptions on how we're going to manage water supply, and kind of comparing that, moving forward under those various assumptions on regulation and permitting of water supply and water demands, which we know are going to change based on the modeling we've done of crop production. Okay, and then flood vulnerability. So talking about this, we did complete we're wrapping up at the moment a flood vulnerability assessment for the Resilient Florida program. So working with the county, we developed, and the cities across the county, we developed a countywide map of critical assets. Looked at critical infrastructure, transportation routes, natural, cultural, historical resources across the county. And then we started looking at the flood maps, and unfortunately, Alachua County, like many counties in Florida, has pretty limited FEMA flood mapping. So this is showing the extent of the modeled flood zones within the county, and a lot of these models are very out of date, so really not suitable for modeling future conditions. So we worked with the county to complete a new countywide flood model. So we started that at the end of last year and just wrapped that up. It's using the latest modeling technology, so a combination of 2D overland modeling with a 1D pipe network, and based on the latest LiDAR. So a very up-to-date model with more than 14,000 stormwater structures represented. So the county has a good database of stormwater infrastructure that we were able to incorporate. that very high resolution. So the model resolution, it's a gridded model that runs at 80 feet in the rural parts of the county, down to 10 feet in some of the urban areas. So give us just a new insights into flooding in the county that we haven't had before. And we're able to validate and verify that model. So against Hurricane Irma and Tropical Storm Elsa, and the county and the city of Gainesville have done a great job in documenting high watermarks and with gauge data. So we're able to get some good validation and of those model results. Like extreme rainfall, we've just used that model to evaluate the effects of extreme rainfall, and we know those are that, as Marcus said, depths and frequencies are changing. So looking at how those rainfall depths will change, 100-year one-day storm currently at 10.5 inches, that by 2070 goes up to 15.4 inches, and the 100-year 10-day storm goes from 16 inches up to 22 inches. So some significant changes in rainfall projected for Alachua County. And then we can start looking at the impacts of that on the community. So in this case, what is shown in purple with the yellow outline is the FEMA flood risk, 100-year FEMA floodplain. And we just have about a dozen homes impacted by flooding in that floodplain. When we take the latest model, taking the latest modeling approach, what we're showing is that floodplain is really not adequate, and we're showing that a fairly significant portion of that neighborhood is actually currently at flood risk. So this is using a much newer, more modern modeling approach. We can identify that flood risk under today's conditions. And then we can also look at that flooding in 2070. So just we add about 50 more homes get added to the floodplain by 2070 if we don't take some, address that. There is a levee in this portion of the county that is being projected to be overtopped by 2070. So some significant impacts projected. Okay, I think that was it.
All right. Well, thank you, Justin and Mark, for that great presentation. I do see a few questions down there in the chat, and I think Mark has been fast at typing out some great responses as well. So again, I'll just a quick reminder, use that Q&A function down in the chat if you have additional questions on the presentation here today. I know the presentation, obviously, Justin focused heavily on the vulnerability assessment with Alachua County and the unique geography and economy of an inland county. And Mark, I think on yours, and I'm sure you've all worked with other counties, and maybe talk about some of those different impacts that you would see in an inland versus some of the coastal counties. I know that peril flood assessment and some other of those sea level rise impacts are probably a little bit more prevalent.
Certainly. I mean, yeah, we've got a number of coastal communities, cities, and counties that we're working with, and of course, using the sea level rise to elevate the boundary conditions for the, say, intercoastal and the riverine systems is definitely important aspect of the modeling that we do, and then combining that, of course, with the coastal modeling and inundation to create the compound flooding. So when we have, again, a couple of communities that abut the St. Johns River, and they in fact need to also take that sea level rise scenarios into effect as it relates to tidal changes that they're seeing along the St. Johns River, and then how that takes itself up into the riverine systems all throughout those communities. So I'm not sure if I addressed your question, Jeff, but we can dive deeper if any of the attendees have any specific questions as it relates to the type of infrastructure that we're looking at.
And then I saw your answer there to the first question we got in the Q&A about the types of modeling used for the modeling effort. And I know folks can see that answer if they click on the Q&A function, but if you wanted to elaborate any or talk more about that.
Sure, and maybe Justin, feel free to chime in here on the maybe the anonymous attendees question about the outdated floodplains and flood maps, and what stipulations for using a flood map other than FEMA to address the vulnerability assessments. And I think, for those folks in the room who may have done some of this modeling, and again, Justin's a resident expert, in a lot of cases, those FEMA flood maps models don't even exist digitally anymore. And so, trying to reproduce a fairly antiquated, very coarse resolution model from, that you pull from an old report versus doing kind of what Justin's showing that we're doing in Alachua County, which again, maybe some may perceive that as going, I would say, above and beyond the call of duty, but can you afford to do that within your vulnerability assessment? And I would generally answer yes. And we think that you can't afford not to do that level of analysis to support the type of assessments, the type of graphical products that you're going to produce that are going to be put in front of your community. You need to have confidence in the models that you're using. And so, in some cases, again, we're updating existing models. Obviously within Southwest Florida Water Management District, there's lots of pretty thorough flooding, swim and ICPR related models that are there for the taking to update. But in other cases where they're not thorough in terms of their spatial extent, that's where we're using this approach like Justin showed that we're using in Alachua County to do more rapid inundation approach, but it's still very thorough, very accurate, and supports, we think, goes above and beyond the call of duty as it relates to if you interpret what the vulnerability assessment in the Florida Resilient Florida DEP requirements are. And we vetted those sorts of approaches with DEP and have their support for sure.
And I do want to remind attendees, and I know is in the first presentation from Mark of that statute in Chapter 380. That is 380.093, where it spells out the vulnerability assessment requirements. Again, I think it was mentioned earlier during the webinar that there will be another grant cycle upcoming in July, and this session, there was an additional $20 million for those planning grants, and another $300 million for the overall Resilient Florida grant program. So again, a lot of dollars out there. And I don't see any other additional questions in the chat right now. I may kick it. Go ahead.
Jeff, I guess I'd follow up on that comment. You talked about the additional funding for this upcoming grant cycle. We were working with one local community who took a stab at what they thought they needed to support, a vulnerability assessment, and may have shot a little low on that, and so they. We're going through that process now on the grant work plan to essentially revise the application and say, okay, well, now these monies are going to be used for this first 2 or 3 steps in the VA, and in this next grant cycle, we'll go after the additional funding to support the following steps in the vulnerability assessment. And I think I made a comment to this effect, but I mean, use this opportunity to also create a reasonably decent inland inundation model to support not just the vulnerability assessment, but just general stormwater planning exercises. And I think, getting back to the point that we kind of made in some of those early slides is, the vulnerability assessment does not require an adaptation plan. But we find it to, even though it may dilute some of that funding for some of the early planning exercise, we feel like it's important to get projects and sort of early out projects that you already potentially have identified, the critical infrastructure that's that is impacted through current flood risk and will certainly be more so in the future. And be able to have those identified in your adaptation plan, and then be able to go after those projects and the implementation grant funding, which is a 50% match.
And again, I'll put out another last call for asking the experts here that we have with us. There we go. There's another question here coming in on the chat. And I'm going to do my best here in reading it for my screen. Mark, I don't know if you can see it a little bit better than me. I don't know, Justin, that's getting a little further on the geoid side. I know that we've done a lot of averaging for tidal gauges, and the example that we provided in an earlier slide, and I have to go back quite a ways to show that example that we were showing for tidal information. But any thoughts on that question, Justin?
Yeah, so I think almost everything we've looked at has been based on geoids older than 2000. And what we've done is we've had to project those forward. But I know we'd work with some experts on that, on exactly how to project those forward, because it's not straightforward. You have to know the datum of each of the tidal gauges.
Yeah, I mean, this was the graph to the left on this one was kind of surprising to us to see that, at least the mean high water that, has historically been used for most of the coastal and inland inundation modeling in, say, Northeast Florida had always been roughly 2 feet. And that was supported by some of the regulatory agencies. But, as we started to look at this and do our own averaging of it in conjunction with our coastal modeling team, we found that to be half a foot higher. And so the mean high water from 96 to 2023 over the past 7 years has gone up half a foot. And so then using that as the basis for our work moving forward for a lot of the things that we're doing in Northeast Florida.
And Mark, Justin, want to make sure we're going to wrap up the webinar. If you want to provide any takeaways for our attendees here today, or folks who might be listening later on.
Just if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We're happy to support any experiences that you're having with your vulnerability assessments or questions that you have as it relates to as you get ready to undertake your vulnerability assessment.
Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us here today. The Florida Association of Counties. I'm Jeff Scow and Mark Nelson and Justin Gregory with JonesEdmunds. I hope you have a great day.